Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here, and we're so glad to be together. And I'm joined by Savannah Kimberlin from the Barna Group. Welcome, Savannah.
Hey, Carey. Glad to be here.
Well, we have Rich Villodas on this episode and the next one. We had a wide-ranging conversation about all things pandemic, crisis. And then we got into spiritual formation, which is really important. And you were working the numbers. So tell us what you found this week as we try to keep people up to date with this constantly changing world.
Oh, I know we're trying our best, Carey. We really are. Things are evolving very, very
Yeah.
quickly. So when we're talking about spiritual formation, a great place to start is with spiritual practices. So just how are pastors doing with spiritual formation for their congregants and the people in their pews, right? So we see that 60% of church adults say that online or streamed services are the only activity their church is offering them during the pandemic, which is a bit of a red flag. So there are not other offerings. So when we're talking about spiritual formation and spiritual disciplines and practices, I think that's red flag number one.
So let's break that down. I don't want people to miss this, and I want to make sure I'm
Yeah.
understanding it right. Okay, so you're saying 60% of church goers, this is not leaders, but 60% of church goers are like, look, the only thing you guys are doing is services or streams. That's it?
That's right. That's right. That's all that they're getting offered.
Wow. And I would just say, because I've been criticized for this, that in the spring it seemed like we were really innovative, doing prayer services and all these things, and then by summer, listen, I get it. Leaders are tired, they're exhausted, but what I saw leaders do was, come to Sunday became watch our stream, watch our stream, watch our stream, and so people are saying, can you take us a little bit beyond the stream? Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing too that similarly, pastors, when they're kind of reflecting on their own performance, I guess, with spiritual formation for their congregants, they're like, yeah, we're not doing very well. So even when asked, like, are you doing discipleship well this year? Only 6% strongly agree. So the data
This is a pastors or people in general?
yeah, that pastors. So only 6% are strongly agreeing that they feel that they're doing discipleship well. So when we put those two data points together, it's like, all right, we probably need to do a little bit better.
Wow. So all we're doing is streaming, the church is saying, and only 6% of pastors feel very strongly that they're doing discipleship well. Do
Yeah.
you think that might be connected to the fact that a lot of churches haven't been able to meet in person the way they thought? Or do you think that's just any more insight into that?
Absolutely. I think in order to really do digital discipleship well, our data has shown that it requires a lot of innovation, so much innovation, and perhaps the leaders up to this point really did not plan to develop a whole innovative discipleship successful strategy online. And they were thinking, okay, we can just cope, we can get by. But what we're seeing as a result is less engagement, and it's doing more harm than good, is what our data suggests.
Wow. Okay. That's hard news, man. That's hard news. I know we
It
get a lot of
is.
tired pastors and the whole deal. And we're going to look, I think, in part two, a little bit about how pastors are doing. Anything else you want to share that
Sure.
could help leaders lead? It's a really good note to file. Like if come to Sunday, which we know from historic Barna data was getting harder and harder every year because church attendance was declining in every demographic and becoming more sporadic. And then we just pivot to watch me. We're probably just continuing the slow slide into less and less effectiveness. What do you, I'm not asking you to solve everyone's problems, but John Tyson has talked about offering courses, and Nikki Gumbel's brought Alpha online and seen a huge resurgence in that. So you're saying even innovation is as simple as that to offer something on the menu other than just watch my sermon.
Yep, absolutely. And that's actually a really great transition point into a glimmer of hope that maybe we are seeing in the data.
Good. Bring us hope. We need some.
Right. I know. It's like I can't end on bad news. That's not
Yeah.
not the Barna way. So where is there a glimmer of hope? Where is there innovation? Where are we sort of seeing, even in little bits and pieces, where are we seeing these glimmers of hope? Well, one way that we are seeing glimmers of hope is in digital group online prayer, which was interesting. And so we're actually releasing a journal on that this week, I believe, actually, with Alpha, our partners, on what it looks like to do prayer in a digital context, because that's a type of innovation that is a type of spiritual formation that maybe it's thinking outside of the box for a lot of people. For a lot of church leaders. Oh, what does it look like to really focus on prayer in a service? Or what does it look like to do a whole service around prayer alone? Like, that is the purpose of the gathering, right? That may be thinking outside of the box for a lot of leaders. So we wanted to focus on that because it makes sense as an innovative solution that churchgoers and unchurched alike would be open to. And why is that? It's because there's a general warmth towards prayer. People feel positive emotions. Christians are very open to praying for other people, either through intercession or praying for their needs, the needs of their friends, or so on. And especially younger generations love prayer and the intimate, emotional connectedness that they feel to God during prayer. There's such a warmth here. And so perhaps that is an innovative glimmer of hope and a solution for spiritual formation for digital church.
Well, and I should say too, because I've had a conversation or two with Nicky Gumbel this year, and he was highly skeptical of digital ministry and has publicly said he didn't think Alpha Online would work and was opposed to it. And then the pandemic hit, there were no other options, and he's blown away and converted into what it could do. So in person, of course, is going to come back, post pandemic, but I don't think he's getting rid of the explosive impact that online prayer, online church can have. So Barna has a brand new resource that you've co-produced with Alpha. Can you tell us about it? And then we're going to jump into the conversation with Rich Villodas.
Yeah, absolutely. So we spend some time really unpacking how to do group prayer in a digital context. What does it look like to be effective and to have powerful, life transforming prayer services in a digital context? So we explore barriers to engagement. We give some tips and some practical pieces of advice for how you as a leader can lead your people in prayer in a digital context and do so effectively. And we talk about a lot of different things, but hopefully it's a very practical resource for how to incorporate powerful prayer into your Sundays and into your services.
And that's at barna.com/digital church. So you can find it all
Carey.
there. Well, without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Rich Villodas. He is the senior pastor of New Life Church in Queens, New York, right in New York City. We talk about being at the heart of the pandemic when it broke out in the spring. He's also the author of The Deeply Formed Life, which was recently named Book of the Year by Christianity Today. So my conversation with Rich Villodas. Rich, welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's really good to have you.
Carey's good to be back on with you again.
Yeah. So you have been leading for about 7 or 8 years a large multiracial church in Queens, right in the heart of where the pandemic was possibly at its worst in the spring. You're leading right through it as a successor. A lot of young leaders listening going, yep, this is what I inherited and here I am. What have been some of the hardest moments for you leading right out of Queens, New York City?
Yeah, as you mentioned, and the New York Times just did a piece covering Queens, Elmhurst as the epicenter. We knew that a number of months ago, but another report came out highlighting the stories and the people, which was really hard to read. So, I mean, number one, the loss of life. I think in March and April and May, I lived 2 miles from our congregation and about 2 miles from Elmhurst Hospital, which was the epicenter, as you mentioned. And to hear the sirens of the ambulance just nonstop, it actually faded into the background because that's how often we heard it. So the sadness of the loss of life, the sadness of so many people losing work. And, we have, Queens is 50% of Queens is foreign born, and where we're at. So lots of immigrants, lots of people who are adjusting, number one, to life in a new reality, life in a new country.
Right.
So that's been hard. What's also been really hard is just pastorally, because Sunday gatherings provided at least some semblance of connectivity where I see someone. Oh, I haven't seen so and so in a while. Let me give him a call. Give her a call. I had a conversation with some congregants yesterday after our service. We had a sermon discussion time. And one of our congregants who's been there for a while shared that a number of months ago, she had COVID and she was in the hospital for 10 days. And the fact that I was finding out months after this had happened was just so sad to me. And I thought, it's a pretty large congregation, but I thought, why didn't you mention anything? And she didn't have any good reason, but that's been hard. And then lastly, I just think just the political differences and how that's been exacerbated in a pandemic, whether we should wear masks or not, should we have services or not. I mean, I have felt just the challenge and the tensions of that on a weekly basis. So, but those are some of the things that have been pretty challenging over this pandemic.
Yeah, a couple of things just to orient the listeners, because you and I talked about this earlier. Elmhurst Hospital, if you remember back at the start of the pandemic, there were those pictures, correct me if I'm wrong, but the pictures of the tractor trailers that were brought in to take care of the bodies, the cold storage, that's the hospital, right?
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one.
And that's what, around the corner from your church?
Yeah, less than a mile.
Wow.
Our congregation.
Wow. How, because this has been a challenge for a lot of church leaders, but you do lead a large church. So typically pre-COVID, how many would you see in person on the weekend? Because I want to ask a pastoral care question. It's just
during the weekend, we probably see anywhere between on a Sunday 14 to 1,600. So because not everyone's coming to church on the same day, we probably have a congregation of about 2,000 people who are coming, who are part of our congregation.
Yeah, so that's a large church by any measure. And you mentioned there's this one woman who had COVID and you didn't know. How do you handle pastoral care on scale with a church that size, particularly now in this weird mashup where, are you reopened yet for in-person?
Yeah, we're closed now, but
we closed again. Yeah,
we closed again. But in August, we tinkered with it and had about 3 weeks where we were just seeing best practices. And then for about 2 months, we were able to gather. But it's on the rise again, so we've decided to pause again.
Yeah, same. This is day one of semi-lockdown for us where we are right now. So it's just crazy. But how do you do pastoral care in that context?
One of the things that, I think it's just for us in the providence of God's timing is last year, we recognized we really needed to do more pastoral care beyond just what our pastors could do. And, for some churches, this is part of their culture, but we didn't have a culture of like deacons who are part of our congregation. And we recognize there are a lot of people in our congregation who have pastoral gifts. They'll never be called a pastor, but they're pastors. They have those gifts, that personality, that temperament. And so we identified about 25 people within our congregation who we believed had the maturity, the wisdom. We had trainings, and we set in what we would call, just deacons. And those 25 folks have been exceptional at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of the phone calls, the grocery drop-off. So we recognize as a pastoral team, and certainly we have our small group leaders and all of that there, but we recognize we needed another service pastoral arm. So when the pandemic came, we had another group of 25 people in addition to our 8 pastors who we could tap into for the sake of pastoral care.
Just kind of always interested in this question. It's more a macro leadership question, but how do you determine who you care for as the senior pastor and who gets delegated? That's always a tension, whether you lead a church of 50 or 5,000. How do you handle that?
The way that I typically approach it, number one is I want to pastor our staff well. And I want to so in our context, that's about, 30 to 35 people. So I want to pay attention to the health of our staff. Secondly, I recognize that although I am one of the elders on the board, it's when I get off the board or when those board meetings end, I'm the pastor. And so I spend a lot of time in contact. I have a monthly meeting with one of our elders each month just to check in, spend about an hour, hour and a half with
Like
them.
one-on-one?
One-on-one each month.
How many elders do you have?
We have 8.
Oh,
Uh,
that's more than a day's work. Yeah.
Yeah. So once a month, we're spending time. We're going over their own personal rule of life, how they're doing. How can I pray for them? And then at that point, I think about I recognize who are the most spiritually influential people in our church who are carrying a lot of weight. And it's those people that I spend a lot of time just checking in with. And then, the last category is, as I'm on Facebook or social media and I hear about something, I want to pay attention to God and, Lord, who should I be reaching out to? I just saw someone lost a job. Let me just call that person and spend 30, 45 minutes on the phone with them. So it's that kind of in the moment, trying to be led by the Spirit to see who I need to be reaching out to in a given month.
I don't mean this to sound like a silly question or trivial question, but how have you seen the pastoral care needs of your church change or spike over the last year? And what are you doing about that?
Yeah, in terms of the needs, part of the big needs have been the economic support that people have needed. The challenge, however, is because there's so much shame that's attached to asking for support. It's been interesting, at least for me, and I've had to tell a lot of our pastors to really encourage people. Early on in the pandemic, we raised a lot of money for people who were going to be economically impacted by the pandemic. But what surprised us was a lot of people were not asking for the money.
Yeah.
And when I started asking the question as to why, so much shame was connected to people who've been working all their lives, people who are proud and in a good sense of the word, and they're hard workers. For them to ask for money was such a painful thing to do. So I would have to, it's like pulling teeth. Like, do you need support, financial support? And the answer would be like, yes. Well, let me just get my assistant to support, follow up with you. But that was an interesting thing about getting people to actually receive help, which is a spiritual formation issue. How do we open ourselves up to receiving the help? And yes, the uptick in terms of the mental health challenges that people are experiencing, having to homeschool children and people who are not, my wife and I, we're pretty adaptable, but it's been incredibly stressful with a 6-year-old and an 11-year-old. So, and to homeschool them every single day. So we've seen a lot of those pastoral challenges arise. But we're doing a lot of fishing in terms of trying to encourage people to be honest about their struggles, which has been pretty challenging.
How do you do that? Like, if I come to you and you suspect they're explain fishing, you have to ask 8 questions, or what do you do to make sure that you're actually caring for people?
Some of the questions that we use at New Life, we use with our staff a lot. We use in different contexts is, can you tell me what's impacting you most and how you're feeling about it? And those 2 questions, it's amazing how those 2 very simple questions kind of go beneath the surface, and the presenting problem we realize is not the real issue. There's something deeper at work. So that's been a question that I know I've used a lot. Yeah. What's impacting you most? And then how are you feeling about it? And we have, sometimes it's not financial. Sometimes it's just, I'm incredibly lonely or my marriage is struggling right now. But those have been a couple of questions that have helped to get to some of the practical needs that people have.
Yeah, it's somehow different than "How you doing, Rich?" Right?
Yeah.
Which we're so used to just the deflecting answers.
Yeah, and the answer is usually "I'm great, blessed,"
I'm great,
or whatever the Christian cliche response is.
So one of the conversations that's happening around the first year of the pandemic and the crisis we're in is that it's a very unequal crisis. People have had record years. People have had horrible years. You're in the crucible of it. You're a multiracial church. Is it 70 nations represented in your congregation?
Yeah, just over 75 nations.
75 nations. So this is like for real, a diverse church, but also economically diverse. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in terms of the impact of this pandemic and the crisis on different economic brackets, different races? What do you see?
Yeah, there's been so many disparities at work that
Mm.
have been revealed. And
Mm.
so one disparity is there's a chunk of people in our congregation who have the luxury of just working from home.
Yeah.
Whereas folks on the lower socioeconomic scale don't have that same luxury. And so they have to work at the grocery store. They have to do some of the, work at the whatever salons or whatever work that they
Yeah.
have
The
that doesn't
distribution center, the warehouse,
distribution that
yeah.
doesn't afford them that kind of luxury, which puts them at greater risk of getting COVID or losing work. You have a lot of restaurant waiters and servers who go to our church as well, and so we've seen the disparities of that there. We've also seen in our context, in Queens, poverty looks different in Queens than it does in other places. In other places, some of the signs of poverty are abandoned buildings or drugs or whatever it is. In Queens, one of the signs of it's very deceptive, because one of the signs of poverty is that there are multiple families living in one home. And so, 3 families living in a 2 to 3 bedroom apartment, and they're working and they're coming home, and now COVID is spreading. This is actually one of the issues that one of the New York Times articles presented. So in our context in Queens, and where we pastor, we're a regional church, but so people are coming from everywhere. But where our church is and where we do our local community development work is in the poorest area in central Queens. And so we've seen the economic challenges, the disparities, multiple families living in one home, which now exacerbates the COVID problem for them. So we have, and then lastly, what comes to mind is because it's a immigrant community, for many people, English is not their first language.
Right.
And so we have seen many children not have adequate technology to be homeschooled. And so because so much gets lost in translation. And so what we've had to do with our Community Development Corporation is identify many of the families in our community and try to connect with them, whether they're speaking Mandarin, whether they're speaking Spanish, to try to support them and give them, the tools that they need. The city's doing the best that they can, but there's so many gaps that the city's not going to be able to reach. So we have found ourselves trying to serve families, but all of the problems and the disparities are exacerbated in the pandemic.
Right. Those were there before. They just got much more extreme.
Yeah.
I'm beginning to realize that working from home is really a place of privilege for a lot of people. That seems to be the story. I wouldn't have thought about that a year ago, but that idea to be able to call the shots or to move or whatever versus, there's healthcare professionals, but all the service people, those are generally not high paying jobs. And you're beginning to see a lot of vulnerabilities. I think that perhaps we didn't notice as much even a year ago.
That's exactly right.
We're all looking for silver linings. Are there any silver linings? Is there anything that you're saying, hey, here's some opportunities we've been able to seize the first year in?
A few come to mind. One is I have been floored by a community like New Life, people coming together and serving those within their small group communities. I love hearing 2 weeks after the fact it's happened that someone had a need, and a group of people who've been walking together for months or years have taken care of that need. Wow. And I'm finding out about it two weeks later because in our pastoral staff, one of our pastors is saying, hey, here's a great celebration. 2 weeks ago, someone had a financial need and the small group came together and helped them. So I've heard plenty of those stories, which has been great. I've also been encouraged by the resolve of many of our leaders to keep our mission moving forward. We're starting a new congregation, our first congregation, which will be kind of a multi-site thing with in our context, live preaching, but in Long Island in the fall of 2021. We did not anticipate starting a church and forming a church in the middle of a pandemic, yet the core group of 30 to 40 people right now are saying, no, we're going to move forward. We're going to start this congregation. So seeing just the missional urgency and the creativity and innovation has been incredibly encouraging. And then for us, I mean, we're just continuing our mission, just utilizing the technology that we have. We started the School of Formation in September. This was supposed to be in-house, in person. We realized we have to make significant adjustments and have everything online. It's not ideal, but people are saying we're still going to do it. So I've been incredibly, and I know that's just not New Life Fellowship. I know churches around this country and around the world are still saying, we will still, no pandemic is going to stop the church from being on mission. And however we need to do it, we're going to do it. So that's been incredibly encouraging for me.
We're going to talk about emotional health, spiritual formation in the second interview you do with us. So I want to come back to that in that school of spiritual formation. Let's talk about online though. Let's talk about streaming. You have been, I take it from what you've said, online most of the last year now since the pandemic started, not by choice, but just, you got no other options. What have you learned about the strengths and the limits of being online?
In terms of the strength, I mean, the number one is just the reach of people, and especially new people. I have an uncle named Albert who lives in Florida, and because we've been going live, and we've been doing live stream for maybe 2 years prior to the pandemic, maybe 3 years. So it was a very easy transition for us. But what I have discovered is so many people who would never walk into church, because they see this live stream being regularly thrown out there, they are curious about it. And there are so many people. We just had a newcomers virtual gathering last month. And I discovered a number of maybe 3-4 people within that group of about 25 who are not Christian and heard about New Life, started watching, and heard that we were having a newcomer gathering online. And so they popped in. They didn't show their face, they just had their name. So It was on Zoom. So they still
it was a Zoom thing. So it's like
they still wanted that anonymity, but even so the reach has been wonderful. Also, I mean, it forces us, because it's online in this way, to be tight and be intentional. And, we recognize people are going to log in and log out and tune out very quickly. So it's forcing us, what needs to be said, that has to be said. How can we do it extremely tight? So that's been a strength for us, to tighten our message, to tighten all that there. So those are a couple of strengths that, and it doesn't cost much, Carey. So
yeah.
Pretty nice.
Before we go to weaknesses, can we talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah.
We all had to tighten up and everything. What do you find to be resonating? What have you experimented with that you want to continue? And any thoughts to mix it up?
I recognize, Leonard Sweet, he wrote a book, and it might have been on postmodernity some years ago, but he said we live in a TGIF world, the Twitter, Google, Instagram, Facebook world. And he talked about the importance of images. And, we're in an image saturated world. And I have learned, whether in preaching, especially in preaching, the importance of images and metaphor, and utilizing that as just a communication tactic. So that's been something beyond just the seeing, people want to see it. They want to turn the ear into an eye. And so that's been something that I've been really in my own preaching, and how I'm training preachers at New Life, to leverage the images, that those things go a long way. So
what will be an example of that?
Just yesterday we had one of our preachers, she was talking about Advent, and, how the light breaks through the darkness. And she shared a picture. It was such a simple picture of just dawn. And she had tied it to a story of hers. And I just realized the more images we can use for people to engage them. She shared, and for me, I wasn't in the church building yesterday. I was at home watching the service. And the metaphors and the images that she used, I mean, like anyone else, I can get very distracted, but it was just it was an incredibly engaging way of just staying connected. And so she just posted that picture and just talked about it. And in some contemplative traditions, we hear about Lectio Divina, of the slow reading of scripture. There's also Visio Divina, which is this, how we can use art as a means of engagement, as a means of contemplation. And I think preachers can really leverage that, of utilizing images, paintings, artwork to engage people in all the senses. So that's been something that we try to do on a regular basis to engage people who are watching online.
Any weaknesses?
Tons. Well, attention, the attention span. Now, I have a 6-year-old and 11-year-old. I was watching the service yesterday, and my 6-year-old's barging into the room and saying, "Daddy, could you help me with this?" And I'm thinking, can you see I'm watching the service? I'm getting with God. So just the attention span is very challenging. There is no touch. So in the sense of just the greeting of people, the shaking of hands, the hugs, obviously that's a significant miss. And I think the weakness of just all virtual is there's this live encounter dynamic that's just impossible to have without people in the room. And so as a preacher, there's this call and response, there's this interplay between the congregation and the preacher, things that can happen in the room where there's other people that can't happen when there's not people. So I think our preaching on one level is a lot, needs to be more focused, but we're missing some of the interplay and the playfulness that can also often happen when there's just people in the room. So those are a couple of limits that come to mind when I think about.
I'm not a cartoonist, but I was thinking about if I was, here's a cartoon I would draw. I would draw a cartoon of what preachers think is happening in people's home when they're watching the live stream. You got this like wrapped family paying full attention, and then a panel with what's actually happening in people's homes watching the live stream. I think that'd be fun. So if there's a cartoonist listening, send that one in to Rich and I. That'd be great.
What I learned about this actually, Carey, is a month into it, we decided to give our staff a break, and we're going to pre-record one of the Sunday services and play it as opposed to just doing it live. And the first Sunday that we did that, which was maybe in June or something like that, I was shocked as to how difficult it was, because I had my children to pay attention to what was actually happening. So, and what actually happens is lots of folks actually come back to the service sometime later in the week when they have some concentrated time, which is something we encourage as well.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't even have young kids anymore climbing all over me. And I find it's just easier to go and make some oatmeal, while you're worshiping. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is not what it's supposed to be, right? But here we are.
Which is why I tell people as I'm preaching, put the coffee down now, just extend your hands to receive a blessing, so I know what's happening in these homes.
There is a ritual for liturgy, which I know is something that is close to your heart. I wonder if there is some kind of potential with that where it becomes somewhat more of a sacred space. Any thoughts on that?
With the home, you mean?
Yeah, with the home. Like it's going to be here long after the pandemic, right? Yeah. The internet's not going away. So
yeah. I think there is something about, in monasticism, there is something, whenever they're moving to the church, where they're walking, there's a physical movement to worship. And I wonder in our own spaces now, I have a 900 square foot apartment here, so there's only so far we can walk. But how do we create these spaces, liturgical spaces, worshipful spaces where we say, I think there is something to that. I haven't given that much thought in terms of how it's expressed in this context, but certainly I think there is something to fashioning a space for that kind of focus and attention.
Any other tips, tricks, or fails on trying to engage people online? I think it is an experimental category right now. We're all trying stuff and seeing what works and what doesn't. Anything else on just engaging people digitally?
Yeah, well, we've done a few things that I think have helped, and all of this is experiment. So I can't say, hey, but we started a sermon discussion, 30-minute sermon discussion group after the service. And we starting it during this Advent season. And so we've had 50 plus people just jumping on for 30 minutes to talk about the sermon. Whoever's preaching is the one who's facilitating that. What's resonating? What questions are you holding? So that's been a way for people to immediately engage, not just with the pastors, but with one another. We've utilized, at the beginning of the pandemic, for about 4 months straight, I led Monday, Wednesday, Friday midday prayers on Instagram and on Facebook. And hundreds of people were joining there, many from our congregation, folks from other congregations as well, who just wanted a space. But what I realized is lots of people don't know how to pray, Carey, and they need someone to model it and hold the space for them. That's been the most significant finding for me in this. People don't know how to pray, and they need models and someone in real time to guide them. That which will inform their time alone with God. But and so evening midday prayers, sermon discussion guides. We are continuing our emotionally healthy discipleship course online, which has been done really well. But we're doing all we can to engage as many people as we can in our congregation, especially.
No, that's super helpful. And you, John Tyson, Nikki Gumbel are all experimenting with courses and discovering great opportunities there because the digital barrier is so low. Mm-hmm. It's like, you don't have to get on the subway. You don't have to get to the building. You don't have to arrange childcare. You can do it after your kids are in bed, that kind of thing. Maybe we'll come back to that in the second interview. So right now, everyone's got their eyes on the vaccine, and we can all almost imagine a time where our world will be maybe wobbly, but more normal. I'd love for you just to comment. What will the vaccine and the restoring of some form of normalcy solve, and what will it not solve?
I think it'll, obviously, here's a hope, solve a public health crisis, and that people will just be able to walk out of their homes without the fear and anxiety of contracting something and bringing it home. So I think it'll solve that, hopefully. I don't know if it solves anything else, though, Carey.
That's why I asked the question.
I don't want to be.
I don't know what this solves, here. Rich.
And it won't solve the deep suspicion that people have for one another, especially those who don't agree with them politically. Yeah. It's not going to solve the racial unrest. And so I think it gets us in a place where we can return to some of the more public things that we've been doing. And I think, I've seen the spectrum of people with deep suspicion towards a vaccine, and then people who are placing all their hope in the vaccine. And I think to properly position it, hopefully by God's grace and just the medical advances that we have, it'll lead to greater public health. At the same time, that's probably all it's going to do. I think we have an opportunity to continue as a church to form people in the way of Jesus and in the way of love and justice and all that. But it's hard for me to see what else it's going to do and solve, for that matter.
Yeah, fair enough. As you look to the future, you think about leading New Life into the post-pandemic era. What do you think will be the same, and what do you think will be different?
I think something has happened. You alluded to it in terms of just the hybridity of formation in terms of people utilizing technology versus in person. I think we're going to continue to see this hybridity. And I think that needs to be normalized. Lots of pastors are going to be probably discouraged that not a lot of people are coming back. And they're just going to leverage that, the technology that we have. 20% of new lifers are ready to come back at this point. It's not a lot of people in our context here. So I think what'll stay the same, without giving a church cliche, sin will be the same. I mean, we have an opportunity to form people in the way of Christ and in his kingdom. And, I don't think whether there's a pandemic or not, that's still going to be the same issues that we're going to have. Different issues are going to bring about the weaknesses, the sin, the antagonisms, the hostility. And wow, what an opportunity we have to continue to shape people in the way of Jesus.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for my own site on why you should lower your expectations around 2021. And I was thinking it was a bit heretical, but talking to you, I'm like, no. Yeah, I mean, it solves some things, but we're really back with ourselves again. And with
exactly right.
that we haven't solved. You mentioned attendance on return to church. So let's assume a world that is operating with people gathering in crowds again. Any thoughts? But we do now live in this hybrid reality, right? You were before, but especially now. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on the hybrid church, future attendance, moving into the post, COVID world?
I mean, from the pastors that I've spoken to and just my own feel from our congregation, I think it's going to take a long time for in-person to be somewhat normal. And then the question is, what's normal? I mean, you guys have done a lot of research in terms of, what was it, 1.8 Sundays a month people were attending, something along those lines generally. Yeah. And so even before the pandemic, people were coming to church less than 50% of the time per month.
And the research is sobering, actually.
Yeah, it is incredibly. And I get that because we see 1,400 people in our church, but I recognize not everyone's coming to church on a given Sunday. So there's plenty of people missing week in and week out. So I don't see the trend changing anytime soon, but I don't think that's a cause for despair. I think that's an invitation for innovation and creativity, and how can we now meet people where they're at. But I don't see it. I mean, I want people to gather together. I think there is something about being in each other's literal presence. But I don't think the church should be dismayed or discouraged, or pastors especially, when that's not going to be our reality. And I doubt that's going to be our reality.
Yeah. What should church leaders be thinking about now that you don't see enough leaders thinking about?
I think church leaders, the short answer to that is their own formation, their own discipleship, their own maturity. I think what's happening in particular in the United States in terms of the political polarization, the racial unrest, the economic distress, the public health crisis, all these things have brought about, the level of hostility and tensions that if pastors are not paying attention to their own inner lives and how they're leading from a differentiated place, we're not going to have congregations that are modeling something different than the world. And so I do think pastors must learn, and I'm on the journey, how do I lead a congregation faithfully in grace and in truth? And then secondly, beyond just our own formation in terms of our emotional and spiritual life, and Carey, and we talked about this a little before, just the intellectual and theological growth that's required. It's sad, the state of theological nuance and just, how are we thinking through some of these massive issues? It's incredibly disheartening to see pastors who are not thinking on a level that is needed for this particular time. So I do think the theological formation, the intellectual formation, what are we reading? How are we learning? What are the nuances? I think that's what pastors need to be paying attention to in this particular time.
Well, that will be a great place to pick up with the next episode. Why don't we just do that? Okay, we'll plan on it. Rich, this has been incredibly helpful. Your new book is called The Deeply Formed Life. It's available everywhere books are available. Can you tell us a little bit where people can find you online?
Yeah, if you went to richvillodas.com, you could see some of the things that are happening there with regards to the book and some of the resources that I put out. Additionally, on social media, just on Twitter and Instagram, just at Rich Villodas. Those are the places where I'm tinkering with a lot of ideas that make it into sermons and books and such.
Well, till next time. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Carey.
Well, that's part one of my conversation with Rich Villodas. Let me pick that up. Well, that's part one of my conversation with Rich Villodas. We will do part two next time on Church Pulse Weekly. We do have a lot of new information for you over at barna.com/digital church, particularly on prayer. A large new study, some findings with Alpha. And we'll talk a lot more about spiritual formation next time. Hey, wherever you're watching or listening to this, thank you so much for being with us this year. We really appreciate your partnership. And if this has been helpful to you, please share it with a friend. Post it to social. We keep an eye out for those things. And if you like it, leave a rating and review. We're approaching 250,000 downloads. We're not even in this for a year. So grateful for you. And we are committed in 2021 to bringing you more of the dialogue as the world continues to change and change faster than any of us can really keep up with. But that's what we're trying to do on Church Pulse Weekly. So thanks so much for listening. Head on over to barna.com/digital